Well, I think we can start. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Atlantic Council. I know many of you have been here. Many of you have been here before. I'm Dick Morningstar. I'm the founding director and chairman of the Global Energy Center, and so we're pleased to host this afternoon's discussion. The next resource shortage, challenges in specialty metals and new energy sources. And we're firmly committed here to looking beyond just the issues that might be grabbing headlines today. And as new energy technologies emerge and global energy consumption begins to shift in new directions, the issues that we'll be discussing today are going to play an increasingly important role in global markets and in geopolitics. And while discussions of geopolitics typically focus on the hydrocarbon sector, we find ourselves transitioning into a new era where new resources and the geopolitical and commercial dynamics associated with them will play a crucial role in determining the success of global efforts to provide reliable, affordable, and clean energy. So we're lucky to have, I think, and we've been talking for the last 15 or 20 minutes, an incredible group of experts here with us today who possess the technical expertise and the strategic foresight to recognize the importance of these trends. David Abraham, who's at the end over there, quite literally wrote the book on this topic. He's the author of The Elements of Power, Gadgets, Guns, and the Struggle for a Sustainable Future in the Rare Metal Age. And he runs the Technology, Rare, and Electronics Materials Center. Where is that? Because you're in Indonesia most of the time nowadays.
The base is at the Institute for the Analysis of Global Security, which is in Maryland.
Okay.
Just outside.
And Dr. Luisa Moreno, right here, is a managing partner and analyst with the Toronto-based Tahuti Global company and a foremost expert in the metals industry, where she focuses on technology and energy metal companies. And Dr. Anthony Koo, in the middle, is a senior engineer with GE Global Research. You know, that's where, all these new GE ads that you see on television where people are going out in outer space and doing weird things. I guess that's where you're located anyway. But Anthony's a specialist in advanced materials development and systems design, and he recently founded the Sustainable Materials and Technology Scientific Journal to promote technical dialogue in this area. So again, we're pleased to have you all here today. Just as a final housekeeping note, we encourage you to join the conversation on Twitter by following at AC Global Energy and using hashtag AC Energy. So what I'll do is I'll kick this off by asking some general questions of the panel, then maybe get a little more specific. And then we really want to have a dialogue, and it's, we're not a big group. It can be very informal, and hopefully we can have a good dialogue, because I know that the people here, you wouldn't be here if you weren't really interested in this sort of rare esoteric subject, which is going to become more and more important. So with that, I'll ask David if you can kick things off and help set the stage for us by sort of giving us the 10,000-foot view of the industry and explaining its importance and giving us a general context which we can then follow up on.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you for having this event. Annie, Chris, the team here, I'm really grateful for the opportunity to talk and share a little bit on the rare metal space and why is it so important. Back in 2010, I was researching the trade in natural resources in Japan's Ministry of Economy, Trade, and Industry. And got a call from my friend at The Economist to say, what are rare earths? What's happening? What's going on? And at that time, I had worked in the oil and gas area and other areas of natural resources, but didn't know what rare earths were or what the challenge was, and quickly found out that China had cut exports of these materials to Japan, and then spent a long time trying to understand what were rare earths. Why were they so critical to green technology, to just technology in general? And spent, which eventually became 3-4 years traveling around the world to understand what these materials were. But what I learned was that rare earths were just a subset of rare metals that are critical to our society in ways that we haven't fully appreciated. When I look down, I look at my iPhone, and this actually is probably one of the few conversations where people say you can take out your phone. Because when I used to look at it, it was just a smartphone and responded to my touch, but I didn't fully appreciate all of the materials that it takes to make the phone. And each one of the functions within a phone is reliant on a certain metal and a certain property of that metal. So for the fact that you can touch the apps and make them work, or seeming to touch, is the fact that there's an invisible layer of indium that acts as a transparent conductor. The fact that you see the color red is because of a phosphor called rare earth phosphor, the rare earth phosphor europium, green terbium. You can go down the list. The fact that the phone is so small and it vibrates has to do with a magnet made out of neodymium and dysprosium. So these things abound in this phone, and the fact that it fits snugly in my pocket is because of its use of nearly half the elements on the periodic table. Take that broadly, whether it's green technology or the screen that's outside, we're using new materials in ways that we haven't fully realized. So what are rare metals? In general, rare metals, minor metals, some people call them technology metals, are metals that are usually produced in small amounts. So think of the hundreds or thousands of tons annually compared to the millions of tons for copper, for example. In general, they're used in small amounts. Sometimes just the dusting is needed, but it's a critical amount that's actually needed. So they're also very different from oil and gas and coal and copper because they're traded very differently. They're traded often in backroom deals. People don't know the exact amount of material that's being consumed, produced, or traded in a given year. But oil and gas, that knowledge is well known, and there are a lot of people looking at that sector. In fact, these are almost not commodities themselves because they are so specialized. What also makes them different is they're often not mined for themselves. So when we think of copper or gold or iron ore, you're mining that material. But these metals are often byproducts. So they're produced after the fact. And in fact, they used to be nuisance, that miners didn't want these materials in their products. But now we're finding that they have uses, and that byproduct can be a challenge, as Anthony will speak to later. So those are some of the differentiators between those and traditional commodities. There are more, but those are the basic ones. And we look into future demands, as technology becomes more diffuse around the world, as a growing middle class starts to have a smartphone. I remember my mother volunteers at an immigration center, and one of the children had just come in from the Congo, and she saw my mom with her phone, and she wanted to call her grandmother, who had a smartphone in the Congo. That connection didn't exist 10 years ago, and the fact that the middle class and even the poor people are having access to this technology is creating a great demand. The fact that we're churning through iPhones so quickly, the fact that green technology is becoming more prevalent. It just highlights the demand that is going to be there. What we see on the other side are some of the challenges, environmental challenges that we can discuss in greater detail, geopolitical, the production challenges. The processing of these materials uses a lot of acids, it uses a lot of heat, and oftentimes it's an exacting process. you can't just build a new mine and a processing facility for some of these metals. It can, in fact, take 10 or 15 years to set up. So the real challenge is what I'm seeing is that technology is spreading around the world faster than we've ever seen before. For example, the smartphone. Within 4 years of its launch, 6% of the world's people had one in their hand. That's an amazing spread of technology that we haven't witnessed before. Not the air conditioner, not the television, not the radio. Nothing spread around the world so fast. But at the same time, the technology is spreading fast. Our ability to set up the supply lines are increasingly becoming more and more difficult. So there are a number of challenges, but when I look into the future, that's the largest one that I see.
That's a very good overall context for what we'll now continue to talk about. And I'd like to get in and also at some point, maybe after the openings, into geopolitical questions. And we hear so much about rare earths, for example, in China and Afghanistan and so on. And what does all that mean? And differentiating them from some of the other specialty metals. I'm sure we can get into that. But let me turn now to Luisa, who had been an investment banker, right?
Yes.
Before,
Yes, I worked for investment banks as an analyst. Yes.
And before getting into specifically this business, and so maybe you can give us an idea of what some of the commercial and market dynamics that are at play here. Who are the players? I mean, what are the big companies involved in these types of metals, and how are they doing? What's the state of the markets now, and has there been any, for example, any effect on falling commodity prices? Where I've been involved for a long time, more on the geopolitical side, and involved with traditional pipelines. And there's, some of you may know, a big pipeline being built now across Turkey to bring gas from the Caspian on into Europe. The costs of that pipeline have literally gone down over 20% because the cost of steel and pipe has gone down. Now, obviously, they're not specialty metals or rare earths, but is there a knock-on effect at all on some of the metals that you deal with?
No, absolutely. There's definitely so much that can be said here, and I will try to address this. So in terms of the players, like David alluded to, many of these metals are basically byproducts. Some of them, in the case of rare earth metals, which is again a subgroup of rare metals. Under rare metals, you also could include elements like cobalt that's used in Tesla's lithium battery. Also, you could include other elements such as niobium, tantalum, which it's included in your cell phones. There's so many other metals, and some of them, many of them are the largest producer is actually China. China is the largest producer of graphite. Again, that goes into lithium batteries for cars. It also is the largest producer of antimony, is the largest producer of rare earth, is the largest producer. I have a list of vanadium and indium and magnesium and and bismuth and so many other of these technology metals. Some people call them electric metals, and so forth. One could wonder, why is China the largest producer? And it could be a vision. Maybe they were really smart in understanding that they were going to need all these elements, or might have been spontaneous. As they started industrializing, they recognized that they needed these elements, and they literally just went for it, not taking a lot of thought in some instances, about the environment. And we know now that in the case of rare earth elements alone, there are potentially costs in the billions of dollars to remediate some of the sites. So these rare metals exist in many countries. I can say with confidence that rare metals exist in almost every country or every region of the world. The question is not so much whether they are rare. The question is economic. And is it competitive for a country or for a company to develop a certain deposit in a certain country? So in the case of the rare earth elements, which again, without wanting to be repetitive, is a subsection of the rare metals, we know that China is the largest producer. They continue producing, I believe, anywhere from 80 to probably 90%. There are certain elements that they produce almost 100% within the rare earth. And so, it's important to understand that they also consume most of it. I believe probably in the 60% or more. But it's more economic for China to produce these rare earth elements than other countries, or in this case, other companies in other locations. And the reason why we know that is because in the last 10 years, many companies have been listed in Toronto Stock Exchange, and they have raised money through investment banks like those that I worked at. And unfortunately, one by one failed. The most known, I guess, story in the rare earth sector is Molycorp, which was not listed in Toronto, but was listed here in U.S., New York Stock Exchange. And they just filed for bankruptcy. And the reason they filed for bankruptcy is very simple. It was not economic to produce rare earths in California. Yes, they had different issues with their plant, which brings another issue, which is it's not easy to produce these elements. And you have to be you have to be competitive, and that was one of the problems of Molycorp. They have to develop this super plant, which had to be economic, with this alkali plant that they were never really able to optimize properly. They were having issues at the front end with leaching and all these different things. All of that's because they wanted to bring the cost of production to $6 per kilo. And I was tracking the company. I think the lowest they went was about $20 per kilo. So there's so much that can be obviously said about that. But this is just rare earths. But if you look at other companies, I mean, lithium companies have failed significantly. We have RBE Energy, which was previously Canada Lithium. They have issues also technically with their plant, filed for bankruptcy. You have Galaxy also, another lithium company in Australia that had issues. And you could think about almost every element. Companies are struggling to bring new processes because they need to be competitive. And these new processes, the hope is that they will bring prices down, and the West needs that in order to be competitive against China and other countries in Asia, which perhaps don't take into consideration so much the environmental impact. But I don't want to take the whole time, so I'll leave it as that, but okay. We can definitely continue.
That's very helpful, and we can continue. And just building on that, let me ask Anthony a couple of questions. One, why, given the potential future for some of these metals, but given the what Luisa was pointing out about the huge costs of production and bringing costs down. And given that you're at a big company like GE, is this industry going to be one that's going to require the major companies like the GEs of the world to develop these products, to be able to meet the full potential of the products as the metals become more used over time? And then on the risk issue, and then maybe after you, David could also jump in on this. Take China, for example. And we were talking earlier, we heard a lot some years ago about the China risk and monopolizing on rare earths and what happens if they shut off some of these metals. Then I guess there was a WTO case. What is the risk today from the standpoint of sources? So maybe if you could comment on some of those things.
Yeah, it's a long list of questions, but I'll do what I can. I come from humbler origins. I work in technology and engineering. And so what I'd like to do is, by way of a story, explaining how I ended up in this space, try to touch on some of those questions. So if you turn the clock back to about 2008, there was an element called rhenium. Some of you may know about it. Rhenium is an element that is one of the rarest elements in the world. But you need a little bit of it in aircraft engine blades for them to really be able to function at high temperatures without creeping, is the technical terms. They kind of stretch when they're spinning. And GE went through a period of time where the rhenium markets took off, and they went virtually vertical. And that was a tremendous challenge for our business. A lot of different things were done in terms of sourcing, in terms of technology, engineering. All hands were on deck. And after we got through that challenge, that crisis, our senior leadership asked the question, well, what's the next rhenium? There are other elements, there are other things that are potentially at risk, so what is the next thing? And GE has a very, very competent sourcing organization, very strong supply chains, very, very good professionals that can kind of go through and work through establishing markets and going through that. But that assignment actually was not given to them, it was given to some of the folks at the research center, which is where I sit. And the reason for that is that they wanted to bring in a technology perspective to understand not just what's being used, but why it's being used. What are your things that you can do to change out elements if one of them becomes difficult to get? And so that was sort of the reason why I was pulled into this particular exercise. So my predecessor, who kind of kicked off things, was a guy by the name of Steve Duclos. He kind of went through all our businesses, talking to our sourcing teams to understand, what do we use, how much do we use, where does it come from in all of our different products. And so he kind of set up what we call the criticality analysis, basically saying if you go along the periodic table, out of the first 80 plus elements on the table, GE uses something on the order of 75 of them. So we have very, very broad exposure. And if you go element by element, talking business by business, to try to build a picture of what we use, that's a good starting point, because it tells you, where are we exposed and what do we use. The other piece that Steve brought to the story was to say, well, how does it affect us if we suddenly weren't able to get it? And so Steve kind of scored different elements on both of those axes. So some elements we use a lot of, and if we were to not be able to get them, well, maybe we could switch out and it wouldn't be too big a deal. There are some elements where we use a very little bit of it, but if we couldn't get it, it would be tremendous revenue impact. And so we kind of went through that list and identified a short list of elements. And so turn the clock forward from about 2008 to 2010, rare earths hit. And so technology then was involved in our company's response to it. So there was definitely a sourcing element to it. There was engineering, there was manufacturing operations, but technology was brought in to also help figure out how we would respond as a company to that. So that's maybe a starting point as to how our company at least looks at the issue of risk. If you actually go down to the issue of supply risk, which gets a little bit of what David started with and Luisa touched on, prices is a good indicator, but it's not the only indicator. When prices are high, you have a lot of people's attention. When prices are low, that attention and urgency can sometimes go down. When we think about risk internally, we actually have other things that we worry about. And so some of the buzzwords, maybe, or keywords that you might hear are companion metals. And so David touched upon that a lot of the elements on the periodic table aren't directly mined. They're byproducts of other elements. And so in those cases, if you have low prices of the parent element, you can run into challenges where you may not be actually able to get certain other elements that are byproducts because the parent element is not economically favorable. So you can run into those types of dynamics where even if you're willing to pay very, very high prices, it may actually be a physical supply issue. So those are a factor of risk that we worry about when we think about. A second thing we look at is what we call concentration risk. And basically that's very simple. Is if there's only one place you can go to get something, that's a pretty risky situation versus if you have multiple sources. And Louisa talked about this. And China is typically held up as an example of a country where there's a lot of supply risk and concentration risk around certain elements. A lot of elements come out of China. And as a result, because that's the single place that things come out of, you need to watch that versus if you had 5 or 6 countries that were producing an element. So that's an example of that. Going further, it's not just the raw mining supply. You can dig ore out of the ground and refine it to certain levels of purity, and you can run into concentration risk downstream as well. So maybe there's enough of an element, and there are multiple sources around the world, but there's a particular purity that you might need for your type of application. And maybe there's only 1 or 2 people in the world that can make that. So you have to go through the entire supply chain, or at least we try to, and understand that. The third piece I'd like to get at is this idea of competition risk. And so if you take a particular element, Louisa mentioned tantalum. Tantalum is a metal that goes into multiple products, multiple industries. And so tantalum can show up in capacitors like batteries and iPhones. We also use tantalum as a company in superalloys, which are used in metals for jet engines and power turbines and other things. The reason I mentioned that is that those two markets are very, very different, and they're actually competing for the same source material. So you can imagine in the case of, say, a superalloy, the development cycles for that are very long, decade, maybe 2 decades, to actually invent a new alloy, figure out how to make it, if it's going to fly, get it qualified by the FAA, and you're pretty locked in. You have some degrees of freedom, but you're pretty locked in once you have something set. Now, if you have a competing industry, let's say the electronics industry that uses tantalum or suddenly decides in the next iPhone to increase their use or decrease their use, that can really shake the markets as well. And so we think about competition, and that's the last part of your question is when you have technology coming on, it's a wild card. Sometimes technology causes a step jump in demand, sometimes it depresses it. And so that's another reason why people like me have been brought in, at least at GE, to help think through this in partnership with our supply chain team.
Do you look at political risk at all?
We do, but it's challenging to kind of go through and navigate that. So I mean, we score political risk as best we can. But right now, for me, I tend to focus on the technology side of things.
David, do you want to jump in on any of this?
Sure, the political risk is real. The fact that one country dominates production is a concern. And whether that's one country for Brazil and niobium or whether it's in China. And their interest in becoming not only the mining, not only the mining aspect, the processing aspect as well. So it's one thing that you can find the minerals in the ground. The question is, can you process it? And if so, where do you process it? And so what you see in China has been this focus back in the 80s on mining. How do we mine these resources or whatever resources we have? And originally it was to get capital, to get some foreign currency. And then over time they went beyond mining and their focus became more how do we produce the materials from the mined product. And now what you see is the focus more on developing the components. The idea is that the country doesn't want to make Christmas lights for too much longer. They really want to focus on not just putting the iPhone together, but making it domestically. And if you look at China's 5-year plan, you'll see that they have this Made in China 2025 program, which is still kind of being formulated, but it's a general strategy where they're focusing on 10 sectors, mostly high-tech sectors, but that all rely on new materials. So green energy cars, trains, planes, all use these rare materials in abundance. And they want to switch the dynamic where they're relying on components from Japan, Germany, Korea. They want to make those components domestically, which makes sense if you're a country and you want to develop. And they're using these rare metals as a way to encourage companies either to come over or to develop these technologies locally. And they rely on, and this number is somewhat hazy, but they bring in roughly 75% of the components that they use now. They want to switch that on its head by 2025 and bring in, their goal is to bring in rely on imports for 25% of their components. That may seem like little numbers, but that has massive implications to the supply chains of the world if they're successful in meeting that goals. That means companies that are producing in Korea or Japan are going to be based in China if it's successful, or they're going to produce things domestically. So the rare metals fits into that, that's the key input. And when I go to China, I was in China in 2013 at a rare earth conference in Guangzhou, the middle of nowhere, China. And there were 500 scientists pounding away just on rare earths. There was a session on how to use rare earths to replace rubber. China relies on rubber for 100% reliant on imports for rubber. You go to a comparative conference in the U.S., there are not 500 rare earth scientists. You're lucky to get 100, 125 on all of the critical materials. And at those conferences, we're talking about how do we not use material. So in the long term, if you've got countries and companies are figuring out how to make products and saying, you know what, I'm not going to use this material, and this material. And you've got countries and companies out there saying, I want to make the best product I can with using any material. Over the long term, that country is setting itself up in a better position to make better products over the long run.
So, I mean, it sounds to me, even when talking about a country like China, that the risk isn't so much at this point political risk that they, although they could, I suppose, quote, weaponize rare earths so as to use it for political purposes and, and playing political games with other countries, which maybe that would continue. But it sort of comes back to the competition point that that Anthony was making, that if they have many more scientists doing research and are developing their own domestic businesses to use these resources that they have, they're going to have less to export, or it'll be at very high prices.
Less interest to export, and the hope is to use these things domestically. I think what one of the underappreciated aspects to the manufacturing boom that China had was, there's also a lot of talk about the environment. As Anthony had mentioned, lower environmental standards allows companies to operate more inexpensively. There's talking about loans that companies get if they're based in China. But what's underappreciated is the fact that the materials are there and the materials are cheaper. And if you're uncertain about supply and you rely on an obscure metal and you have a choice of where your production is, and if you're uncertain about the supply chain, why not move to China, where you're going to have access to inexpensive materials for the long term?
Luis, what's your reaction to this? From all what you've all been saying, these metals are going to be becoming more and more important. There are the risks that have been, that you all have been talking about. If you had to develop a strategy so that 15 years from now we had the access to all the metals that we needed, and to mitigate the kinds of risks that we've been talking about, what would you do?
Yes, that's a very important question. I think there has to be a change almost in culture in terms of how the West in particular, I think, looks at mineral development. So we are used to developing iron ore, copper, and you can build a whole company just around one of these major metals. When you start talking about the strategic metals, we can call them technology metals, we almost have to look at them as technologies. So if you look at the balance sheet of Apple, Honeywell, many other major companies, the R&D section is sometimes in the billions. These companies are not afraid to spend hundreds of millions of dollars, sometimes even billions, developing a technology that's going into their products. That's not the case. That's not the way they see mines. Approaching a GE or Siemens or any other of these companies that use strategic metals and tell them, maybe you should get together and try and help one of these mining companies to develop a process that is economic and competitive and green at the same time, because It's not easy to compete with China and other major producers of these elements using the conventional processes, chemical processes they use, because the impact to the environment is possibly unacceptable in this part of the world. So we almost have to use, the way I see it, and this is completely out of the box, it's to develop almost a different model to support some of these more junior and some emerging companies. And so these companies, many of them have deposits. I mentioned the lithium companies, but they're also developing some rather new processes to refine lithium to higher levels so that they can go into batteries. And they're trying to raise hundreds of millions of dollars for the last few years, and they're not able to do that. If they were developing a lithium technology for batteries, they probably would be able to have their technologies adopted by one of the major producers. So people look at these metals as mining projects. And they are, in the sense that you have, so in some cases, to blast the rock and so forth. But they are electronic, the technological or technology metals, I would say. So that is an important consideration, because China, in many instances, are able to produce at lower prices. But then you have other elements, like I mentioned, cobalt. Most of the cobalt comes from Congo, and competing the costs of extraction in Congo, it's almost impossible. And so Tesla talks about trying to produce or build a gigafactory and source all the elements from North America. You know, it would be interesting to see how they're going to achieve those low costs and be competitive.
So that's really helpful. Let me go back to Anthony and, working for GE. Is it going to take the big companies like GE to work with smaller companies to develop the processes, whether it's in the Congo or other places? And then what's the role of government in this? Should there be government intervention, government subsidies to develop the kinds of metals that are going to be necessary for the future, or can the private sector do it on their own?
So taking the first part, I think there's room for companies, I think, that use things to work with their supply chains to do that. And GE does work with its suppliers to figure out how to do things better. With respect to the government piece, I think there are some green shoots. There is investment by the U.S. government in some areas. So, for example, the Defense Department, the Defense Logistics Agency, does track use of critical materials in the military supply chain. So they do a good job of tracking not just what's used, but where are the different platforms, how does that map out? So there is some awareness there. And so I think that's a good sign. In the Department of Energy, there has been an initiative to kind of track what does clean energy 10 years down the road need in terms of these types of materials. And so they issued a report, I believe, in 2010 and 11, and they're actually revamping that this year, saying if we assume wind, solar, some of these technologies come to fruition at the levels that we'd like to see them at, what's the demand look like, and which ones do we really need to pay attention to? So they are trying to track that, which I think is the first piece. And in terms of action, the DOE has sponsored a Critical Materials Institute, which is actually an R&D early stage initiative to kind of get at some of these questions about how do you look at better extraction technologies? How can you take maybe some materials, like in rare earths, for example, there's a list of 17 elements at the bottom of the periodic table. You actually get them all together, and some of those are more valuable than others. And so one of the projects I believe that the Critical Materials Institute is saying is, can I come up with new applications that creates demand for elements that are in oversupply to kind of make the overall economics look a little bit better? They're looking at alternate magnet materials. And so there is some R&D investment by the government. And so that's the piece that I've been most connected to in understanding how that looks. But I think there is, it's certainly an important issue. It's not just the private sector by itself that has to wrestle with it. I think you've heard from Dave and from Louisa the importance from a U.S. competitive point of view. But from GE's, personal point of view, right, or company point of view, it's important to be able to be competitive and to work with the constraints that we have.
I think the fact that we're talking about critical materials sounds like something new. as it's a new topic, but throughout history, especially since the 1920s in the U.S., when we fought World War I, it was illegal to export tungsten. There was a fight over molybdenum, and these were steel strengtheners that were used in military applications. In the 1930s, there were lists of materials that should or shouldn't be exported. In the 1950s, we were spending hundreds of millions on the development of titanium, just one specialty metal. In the 1960s, there was offices in the State Department and the Department of Defense that focused on non-ferrous materials. In the 1980s, Reagan was dealing with how do we handle a strategic material stockpile. So the fact that we're talking about it now is nothing new. What the aberration was is that we weren't talking about it in the 1990s, in the 2000s. And I think if you look back to then, it was the sense that the market had won. There doesn't need to. The Soviet Union had fallen. We don't need to be involved in certain commodity sectors, and we don't need to be collecting that information. The U.S. Geological Survey, which had been very active in the understanding the markets, had become less so as funding had decreased. But now we're getting to a point where we're realizing, wow, this stuff has value, and it's not just the military. It's not just making something stronger. It's making something lightweight. It's making something faster. It's making something more powerful. And all of those things are about oftentimes efficiency, and that's the green technology. So we're now starting to focus on these materials, and we're talking about $20 million initiatives that are used to study all critical materials. And when you're looking at how much goes to algae research from the government, you're looking at 30 million. Not saying algae isn't important, but there's a whole new set of materials. And going back to Luis's point about the focus on how do we make a lithium battery, and that is critical. How do we do that? But if we can reduce the price of lithium tenfold by developing a new processing technique, that makes lithium batteries that much less expensive, and that means their deployment could be far greater. And therefore, if lithium is used effectively in green cars, then that's a green revolution in itself. So they're knock-on effects. In terms of what the government can do, I'd love to see an international material agency. How do we talk about material issues as we reduce our reliance on fossil fuels? We need an international body. It would be helpful to have an international body to discuss these material issues rather than going through the WTO for a trade case. Sorry.
Let's open it up. I hope there are some good questions. I'm sure there will be. I see two hands first there, and then we'll go over there. Please identify yourself, too, and maybe you could stand up and we have a hand mic for you.
All right. Do you want me to get up or sit down?
Well,
No, I'll sit down. So my name is Michael Yamo, and I work for Bechtel. We do a lot of things in oil and gas, metals, and mining. So do great work with GE all over the world.
could you just hold it a little closer?
Yeah,
The
do a lot of great
microphone?
work with GE all over the world.
Right.
My question points to that environmental risk that we talk about, and also the commercialization aspect of it. Unlike other major metals, I think with the major metals, we are still even facing trying to make environmental risk economical. It's very tough. We haven't achieved that yet, as we still face a lot of hurdles, and it's very challenging. So now you add on this, critical metals, and it's like, oh my gosh, companies like Bechtel, which design and build these massive mining operations around the world, don't want to go in there because we haven't even dealt with the bigger issues. So then you're talking about the future if you don't have these big companies going in and addressing this issue. And then you come to the commercialization part of it, which is, okay, let me sacrifice all this investment to do this. However, I don't have a real market to be able to create transaction and demand and supply. So I feel like, the prospect going forward is almost looking like China has a monopoly, however way you look at it, for probably the next 20 years. That's my guess. I may be wrong, but that's my real question here.
Yes, China has the monopoly and the vision to do it, right? To spend so much money like they did in developing processes for rare earth. It takes a little bit of vision and willingness for risk that we don't see so much here. And maybe because they're communists and things sort of trickle down a different way. But it will be definitely difficult to compete with China. But you're right. There are still issues that we're trying to solve with the existing metals. So if you look at, for instance, aluminum, we use bauxite to make alumina, then makes aluminum. But bauxite has the nasty waste. And a few years in Hungary, I think 2 years or 3 years ago, there was an incident where the byproduct waste basically destroyed a whole village and killed people. So these are definitely issues that we're still dealing with, but we need to be able to then find new processes, and there are. There are companies out there trying to develop new technologies that can improve for instance, the technologies to make alumina and others. But it's very expensive. And from the perspective of the capital markets, investors don't want to be investing in technologies that are going to fail or with such a high risk. That's when I guess government can come in through institutes and so forth and develop new processes, knowing that, and this happens many times in technology companies. You might develop 5 processes and only one works. And at the end of it, you probably spend 300, 400 million. But you have to have that vision that 30 years from now, you become more competitive. So I think that's sort of the vision that some of the countries and governments need to have.
Anybody else? Go ahead.
But yeah, in terms of the China change,
And then we'll go back there. And then
it doesn't look likely when you've got a willingness for the rare earth space. All of a sudden, you'll hear the government is stockpiling X amount of tons of neodymium or dysprosium. That's nice if you're a company and you just have a whole bunch of stuff sitting in your warehouse that the government just bought it. That kind of support doesn't exist elsewhere. So it's tough to compete against that unless you're focusing on how can you create technologies. And that's what the U.S. is good at, is coming up with technologies. The thing that we have to do is make mining and metallurgy a little more sexy, because people aren't spending their time. People from these material sciences schools go to Facebook or to other companies, and we're losing that edge that we worked so hard to create. Nothing against the people who choose that, but we have to find ways to get the people to do what they've been trained to do and find more ways to get people trained.
Where does the technology get developed? Can it get developed in government, with ARPA or, national laboratories, or should it be the government giving grants to, private companies doing it, or both of the above, or
when we're talking about chemical processes, for instance, we know that USGS has done significant tests back in the 60s, and many of the technologies now that are being used and developed in companies that are listed, some in Toronto, that are actually based in technologies that the USGS funded. But all of a sudden, I guess the Cold War ended, and and the focus changed. But that is basically affecting the world economies. It's not just obviously the defense industry that matters; all the other ones, and developing these critical materials will definitely support other industries.
Okay.
Can I jump in?
Sure.
I would agree that it's one of these all of the above solutions. And so when I think about support, right, I think private companies should be able to fund things that are critical to their use. But as Luisa pointed out, some technologies or some things that are really early stage ideas are very risky. And so right now, you see the government seeding and funding pre-competitive research. So early ideas that are really just very, very risky, very low yield, but if they succeed, would be great. And I think that's a fantastic place for government to be investing in R&D, because individual companies may not have the resources to do that. I think as things come closer to market, you can begin to allow competitive forces take place and begin to refine those technologies, and you can get a best of the both worlds type of approach. But I think it is one of these all of the above. If it's truly of strategic interest, then I think you have to invest accordingly.
Okay. Back in the back corner there.
Jeff Epping with Enedis LLC. we've been talking about critical metals, and I'd like to turn to the top end of the periodic chart and actually turn to gases, to helium. I wonder if any of the panelists had any comment on helium. The U.S. is a major supplier of helium. Its asset base is wasting away. It's going to decline and deplete over the next few years, and just see how that looks, if you have any comment on it.
I can jump in with that. Helium is something that as a company we use a lot of, basically in cooling the MRI magnets. So if you ever had an MRI, it's a superconducting magnet that allows you to get the image, and you need to cool that, and liquid helium is used for that. So GE has a fairly significant exposure to helium. A couple years ago, when there was talk about closing the helium strategic reserve, you had a lot of people, not just GE, research universities, everybody basically got together and said, hey, this is something that we need to make sure we pay closer attention to. So helium is definitely something that's critical to many different people. I think the challenge that I saw personally when I was looking into it was that you had sort of a very large externality, in the sense that the U.S. strategic reserve was essentially distorting the market in some respects, so that it wasn't able to respond as agilely as you'd like it to do to market forces. And so I think that sunset provision created some churn, and I think that was ultimately worked out. But longer term, helium is certainly something you need to be thinking about. It's a byproduct of natural gas, and so all the things with respect to fracking, you can begin to see a lot of different interconnections that are somewhat subtle come into the supply of helium. And so it is something that I think is important to think about.
Okay.
Yes, I realize we're talking about many different products, many different markets, et cetera. That said, I'm going to ask an oversimplified question, cross-cutting across this. From the perspective of North American governments and industry, all of whom are collectively investing billions of dollars, and not getting into how much out of which pot, it sounds like and across all these different elements, there's the question of, do we try to diversify sources beyond China, Bolivia, Congo, whatever it is for the different one? To what extent do we invest in reducing the cost of these materials through better processes? And to what extent do we develop ways to minimize the amount of products we need for a given application? If you are the czar in charge of all of this North American R&D funds, how would you divvy up that pot between those three things, very roughly? Is it mostly this and a little of that, or is it one-third, one-third, one-third?
I think that the challenge is who's the we.
Right.
That's the question. Is it Bechtel? Is it GE? Is it the U.S. government? Is it the military? So they all have different interests and different risks. So it's a challenge to say who the we are. The way the U.S. government really looks at these critical materials now is through a defense end. How do we ensure that if a war were to break out, we have enough to build our plane? But what they don't think about is how much GE is going to need to build whatever GE is working on. Excuse me. So there's the question of who's the we and what material is needed. And I think you'd have to look at a company. It's a question of how do you ensure supplies through unstable times, and that means stockpiling and hedging if you can on any material, but it's hard to hedge on. It's impossible to hedge on minor metals. And then individual companies would make sense to say how can we replace X material? But the problem with substitution is we're not good with substitution. Diet Coke doesn't taste like real Coke, and you can't make pizza without yeast. And these materials are used in such small quantities, but they're so critical, and you can't replace them in many cases. So, and if you're spending research dollars on replacement, then you're not spending. I believe if you're spending money on replacing a material, you're not spending money specifically on developing a new product. Sometimes great things happen when you learn how to replace. But I think that the focus should be on how do we build the best product if I'm a company, rather than how do we build the best product without material X, Y, or Z. Although there are risks to that strategy, obviously. So I know I didn't answer your question, but I would just say it depends on the week.
I would say Diet Coke tastes like Diet Coke, and after drinking Diet Coke for the last I don't know how many years, 30 years or whatever it's been. I can't stand the taste of real Coke, so people,
It's a new product.
So it's a new
yeah.
product, and people might learn to like the replacement. So anyway, Bill Eichhorn, and then I'll ask you.
Thanks. Bill Eichhorn, I'm a consultant in town, but I interestingly used to work for a company that owned Molycorp before it became an independent company. So I actually know a lot about the mines that they operated. One of the things that's interesting about the market, I mean, this is more of a comment, and maybe you all can make an observation about it, is that, you know, the technology existed very well to do the environmental controls and do them properly and that thing, but the cost could never be competitive with a foreign competitor that was not internalizing those costs. Therein lies that was the biggest problem. The other thing is that I will say is that even though people called them rare earths or call them rare earths, sort of the internal comment was, well, they're not rare enough. Because there is this, you know, international supply, and because the market for them was very much variable, and so you ran into this trap all the time of to run your mining process, which, you know, moving a lot of dirt, a lot of rock, and that sort of thing, but you would then develop a large enough supply, but you couldn't lay that supply off fast enough. So the combination of high cost inputs, high cost to maintain the product, but then not enough immediate market to cover the cost. And I think that's kind of what you were saying that GE was looking at. Third thing is that, well, I take your point about the substitutes. I think there always has been this question about, are there going to be other substitutes that are coming along at the nano level, for example? And having also worked in the chemical industry, you know, there's a lot going on now to make substitutes at that level. And I think there's a big question, you know, of you know, will there be substitutes? So I just kind of throw that out as some comments.
The substitute, yes, I guess there are substitutes, and there are times where substitutes make a lot of sense, and there are times where you can change your oil refinery to use different materials that are cheaper. There's sometimes where it's really easy to do, but broadly speaking, to replace one material in all its end uses, that's where the challenge is. And when prices go up, people find ways to substitute. So that is real. The question is it real to do it on every instance? And that's kind of what I was highlighting. So I don't think I did a fair enough job. So thank you for pointing that out.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point, that it's tempting to think about this as, you know, there's material X, and material X is used across the board, and there's a critical materials list, and it's the same list for everybody. And I think it would be a disservice to kind of walk out of the room and think, you know, there's one master list that everyone shares. I think depending on your industry, depending on your application, depending on the decade, that list is dynamic, it changes, and technology is a big driver for it, but it's not the only driver. I think you point out economics is a big one, right? If you've got a capital story that just doesn't make sense, everything else could line up, but you can't make it work. And I think that's an important nuance that I'm glad was brought out. It's just, I think it's important to have the discussion. I think it's important to pay attention to it and to kind of hear the examples that we've given up here and say, wow, this could be a really big issue. But then to walk out of the room and think about, well, what are my critical materials in the space that I'm interested in? And are there ones that are common to a lot of people where maybe I can get enough will to move? Like rare earths, I think, really got a lot of people's attention. But different people will have different things at different times. And that's where I think it's kind of an interesting space, because there's a lot of room for private sector as well as the government and others to play.
I mean, I just wanted to say also that's important to note that, again, the vision that many Chinese companies have, or the approach they have. I remember being in San Francisco in a rare earth conference. I think it was back in 2013, 2014. And this Chinese company approached some of the Canadian rare earth companies. And after he had approached and gave his card and wanted to learn more, I approached him and I said, but China is already the largest producer. And he goes, yes, but you know, it's not going to be forever. And so there is always that vision 10, 20 years forward, how they're going to be competitive. And they make the sacrifices now. And I understand that Molycorp had a lot of costs and so forth, but you know, they did have other assets that were sort of supporting the costs, and maybe they should have maintained that for a little bit longer.
We have three hands. We'll start with you, then, and then over. And that'll bring us pretty much to the end of the program.
Hi. Anmol Vanmali, Senior Fellow at World Watch Institute. So from a pure competitive advantage perspective, if China can produce things at the cheapest cost, they get the right, I guess, to be a monopoly. I get that. But yes, the moment you start looking from a nuanced point of view, like geopolitical risk, commercial risk, it doesn't sound like such a great idea. So what is it that companies are doing in real time to mitigate that risk? Are they picking up equity stakes in Chinese mining companies? Are they exploring joint mining sites outside of the China geography, maybe in Africa? I mean, I'm sure companies are doing some things to mitigate this risk, right?
Sorry, what companies? The technology, the Siemens and GEs? No, they don't do that. I mean, many of the major mining companies, even technology companies in China, many of them have the ownership. They are significantly owned by the government, and the government has a lot of say. Here is kind of different.
There is not, easier said than done.
Right, I understand.
Investing
it's
in
different
China.
politics.
Okay, why don't we take both questions and then we'll get responses.
Thank you, Lieutenant Colonel Murado, additive manufacturing lead for the Marine Corps. But I did a lot of research at the Eisenhower School on strategic materials and wrote a paper on Chinese exploitation of strategic materials in East Africa. And to your point, Luisa, I think it's a couple things. It's vision, first of all, and second of all, to everyone on the panel's point, China recognizes the value now. Maybe they didn't. Maybe it was serendipitous at first, but now they recognize the value of it, and they're planning for the long term. So you talk about, what's the next frontier, and from what I'm seeing, it's Africa. And where is China investing far more heavily than the United States government?
Absolutely.
In Africa. And I have many friends from Africa, and I talked to them, and every single one of them said China didn't exist in Africa 20 years ago. Now you can't go, around a corner without running into a Chinese restaurant. It's kind of like the canary in the coal mine in a weird reverse sense. But I guess my question is, obviously China has a strategic vision. Private industry is not going to seek to mitigate, because why would you if you can get it cheap from China and you have factories in China as well as you're a global corporation. And truth in advertising, I'm actually a reservist, so I work I'm a global logistics director for a quartz and ceramics company. And we have a factory in China. And what's interesting is I ship sand from the United States to China. And for 16,000 kilograms of sand in one container, it only costs me about $2,000 to ship that. So I don't need to mine it in China. If I can mine it somewhere else, slightly refine it, beneficiation a little bit, and then I send it for $2,000 in a container to China. So I guess from a strategic perspective, how do we, and it's got to be government driven. Private industry isn't going to drive it, and I wouldn't drive it from a private industry perspective. My CEO, we rely on tungsten. He doesn't care where the tungsten comes from. He just wants to get it cheaper. So at the end of the day, how do we energize the United States government, governments in Western Europe, governments that may want to create some independence for their companies from a strategic perspective, for their industries, and not just defense, but across the board economically? How do we energize the United States government and other like-minded governments to say, hey, this is important, and we need to compete, not just stockpile, but compete with China in these emerging markets like in Africa, for example?
As you were talking, I was thinking about the Dodd-Frank the conflict minerals sort of discussions and legislations and all these things. That's the opposite of what essentially you're trying to suggest, which is the United States needs to be more comfortable going into, maybe places where the geopolitics are not as friendly, let's put it like that. And because China doesn't literally, they don't care. They go where they think it's economic. I'm not saying that it's necessarily right to buy cobalt from an area where people are clearly being enslaved and so forth. But there are other alternatives. Not all of Africa is in war. I just came from East Africa. I was there. It felt extremely safe. Exactly, Uganda, Tanzania, Rwanda, all these places. There's no war as far as I understand, being there anyways. And so I think yes, you're right. These companies need to feel comfortable going there, but buying minerals from areas which are considered conflict areas, even though there's no conflict, there is an added cost for American, producers and suppliers down there. So there is definitely the need of having a much broader discussion in terms of if America is not going to be developing their own industries at home, if America is not going to invest in processes to make the processing and recovery of materials cheaper, where are you going to get it? And if you're not going to Africa to get it, where many of these critical materials are relatively cheap to produce, like tantalum, tin, the 3Ts, and so forth, really, what are the alternatives left? So that's definitely an important discussion to have.
We were talking to some high-level Department of Energy people yesterday on this new project innovation that they're doing, which would double our budget and doing research and development and clean technologies, working on a global. It's a global project. Maybe there has to, which several countries are joining in. Maybe there ought to be the same kind of thing in this area.
If you're having a strategy to develop renewable energies and advanced technologies, it's important to know where you're going to source these materials.
Right.
Because all of a sudden, all these technologies might become more expensive than you thought otherwise.
There was another question over on this side of the, yes, we need a microphone, right? Then I think we'll call it a day.
Thank you. Jun Kuroda from Japanese Embassy. Somehow related to the previous question, but David mentioned IMA. So I'd like to you to elaborate a little bit more about international cooperation dimension. There was also mention about the WTO cases, and I'm sure David knows very well about Japan. Is interested in this issue at least at that time. So how would you see the possibility of international cooperation at especially government level? Also, could anybody talk about the possibility of a reuse or recycling in this context? Is that can be a good way to address some of those issues? Thank you.
The International Energy Agency was founded in the 70s after some oil challenges. And it was just a few countries trying to understand what the market was from the, and it's really grown. And we've had a number of agencies to try and look at the market. What's going on? Where's supply coming from? It's just to highlight the resource, to get a better understanding of these resources. I've been studying for 5 years to try and understand how much rare earth production there is in the world. I have no idea. The best people I know put out statistics and say, you know what, I'm 20% either way. That's a 40% gap. And I think if he could take away 20 and put 30, he would. We don't have a great understanding. So if there's any way that we can start acknowledging this and getting people, countries together at the table where we can talk about material issues, hopefully that can ward off the case for WTO cases where we can discuss the need. So it's getting people together and it's discussing these issues. In terms of recycling, these materials are used in often such small quantities, it's really challenging to recycle from an economic standpoint because you can't recycle a little, a half a gram or an eighth of a gram. And scientifically, we just can't separate these things. It's easier to get chocolate chips out of a chocolate chip cookie and the butter out and then the sugar than it is to find where the dysprosium is in your phone. So it's a challenge that's only gonna get harder as more of our materials become specialized.
Yeah, I mean, and it's the same situation again with recycling. And I look at the stock, the companies listed in the stock market. There are a few that are trying to address the issue of recycling. There is many others that are private. And it's a question of capital to come up with new technologies that can do it economically. And the other, always, I found the discussion when we talk about recycling technologies, it has always seemed to be a trade-off with energy, the cost of energy to extract these things, in addition to reagents and so forth. And usually it makes more sense when the price of commodities are higher. And maybe, again, maybe that's what we need to be doing, is to focus more when prices are high, maybe to focus a little bit more on recycling. And maybe there should be government incentives to do that, so that we can preserve resources and the environment and so forth.
Yeah, I think as a blanket statement, recycling is a nice concept, but it really does depend on the details. So if you have a very high value material that's fairly concentrated, right, you can do that, and that does occur. If you have a dissipative use where it just kind of ends up scattered or whatever, it's like getting your chocolate chips, right? It's very difficult. So I think there is room to play, and in specific cases it can and has been done, that I'm aware of at least. But as a general solution, I think it's one that is not going to be it's not going to work, it's not going to solve the problem by itself.
Any of you like to make any closing comments as we come to an end?
I think in general that we have to stop seeing this mining and materials world as something an over there thing, and our iPhones and our hybrids over here, that they're all related, and you have to understand that, and minor metals is a way to see that. But it's something that we have to start to address before we can do things like green the supply chain or address geopolitical risk and so on.
So I think that, adding to what Dave was saying, I think that it's important for governments to be more involved. I think companies need to be more involved as well. Many of these major technology companies are listed in stock exchange, and they're more interested in showing performance every quarter than getting involved in a 20-year vision or 30-year vision. And I think perhaps the government can come in with some incentives and pull together the private and the public sector.
Yeah, I think it's a big problem, and I think it's one that requires skill sets from across the spectrum. So you need policymakers, technology, you need everybody on working together for it. And so for me, this is one of the most interesting projects I've worked on during my career. So I'm really happy to be part of it and happy to be here today. So it's really neat.
Well, maybe this is a small beginning. And thank you. Thank the entire panel for just an outstanding discussion. There are excellent questions from the people out in the audience. And so let's give a round of applause to our panel. Thank you. And to the audience. Thank you very much.